exchange influences, of course, this cultural and this religious development, but it also affects the political systems in Africa. Because slavery becomes the number one way that Africans are able to engage in world trade, they start to shift, the empires start to shift towards the western edge of Africa. And you start to see a decline of the Swahili as the Portuguese take them over, the rise of the Songhai as they're able to kind of harness this ability to enslave their neighbors and sell these slaves to Europeans. So because of slavery, changes happen within Africa. However, Africa is also deeply influenced by the rise of Islam up in the northern part. Of course, Islam has been there, but a new set of empires, which we'll talk about in a little bit, the gunpowder empires, are also developing. And we see that in particular in Africa, in the Songhai Empire, as they seek to legitimize themselves and to grow and to make trade connections, and by using Sufi and Shiite and Islamic connections. Of course, it's actually a little less strict Islam than most of the Middle Eastern Muslims might expect or want to see. But in the Songhai, this enables the ruler to continue his power significantly over a long period of time. It also changes culture, of course, in America. And one way it does is it affects poor people. It affects poor people by giving them opportunities. In fact, indentured servitude, while a form of coerced labor, actually provides more opportunity to Europeans as they try to go to America, because now they have a chance to go to a whole new world. They have a chance to establish and create new systems and new connections with people. And then after they've served their time for the joint stock companies, they can have their own free land. So this actually is an offer for opportunity. Strangely enough, so was piracy. Piracy offered more egalitarian opportunities for sailors who were basically oppressed and had pretty poor lives, either back in England where they were dirt poor, or even on the sea where they were just the scum of the earth. Where now they have a chance for glory and honor, and usually pirates treated one another with equal respect. And so that actually promoted and encouraged piracy because it offered more opportunities for Europeans. Meanwhile, back in Europe, Europeans are also having more opportunity in terms of the elite, because the gentry who are different than nobility. Nobility are connected to the king. Gentry are developing through money, through trade. And so they're kind of this new money. And they start to focus not on farming, but on trade. And so they can have smaller families because they don't need as many people to work in the fields. And they're able to focus on showing off their wealth. And so we have this new division between first monarchy, then nobility, but then this gentry who are actually richer than the nobility. And that's going to change and kind of shake up empires in Europe. The division between nobility and gentry was across the board. It certainly wasn't unique to one country. However, this was exacerbated and definitely highlighted in the treatment of the nobles in France. France becomes the beginning point and hub of what we will call modern absolutism. Absolutism, you see the word absolute in there? It's all about absolute power to the king. And that absolute power to the king, as defined by people like Cardinal Mazarin and Cardinal Richelieu, who supported the King of France, begins to develop this theory of the divine right, that the King of France rules because God, divine, has chosen him and given him the right to rule. That means he's only answerable to God. It means he doesn't have to answer to any of the people. And it certainly means he can do basically whatever he wants. This gives kind of that concept that everything he does is legitimized and supported by heaven itself. Furthermore, Louis XIV, one of the first figures to really be born into this concept of absolutism, promotes and encourages this concept of absolute power by using Louis XIV is one of the first kings of France to be born into this kind of power, and he uses that to make all of government surround him. The concept that he's kind of the sun at the center of the whole government. He has a phrase, which I will not attempt to say in French, which means I am the state. And he is the government, period. He dismisses parliament. His advisors are just advisors. He can do whatever he wants. This leads to the concept of him being the Sun King. And you see that image right there, which is actually an image throughout the palace that his father and then he continues to build. This palace is the Palace of Versailles. I'm just going to give you a few visuals because it's pretty cool. The grounds itself are 25 miles. That's going to include about our town 3 times. And the palace itself is enormous. It's an example of something called Baroque art, which was an extravagant explanation of power and wealth, again, legitimizing the king's power. Here's the back of the Palace of Versailles, kind of gives you the scale of it. As you enter, it's all meant to produce and invoke fear as you're about to enter into the presence of the king. The famous Hall of Mirrors. Again, you're coming in to meet the king, and this is what you're seeing. You're already overwhelmed by what a great in terms of awesome, huge, powerful person he is before you even enter. Here's a back painting at the time of kind of the back gardens. You can see even in the corner his personal zoo that he had. The fountains, this is a make-believe picture because the fountains would never have been running all at the same time. There were too many fountains to provide enough water. So basically what they had was a system of warning servants and a whistle system that as the king was passing through the garden, he knew it was happening, of course, but as he's passing through, they would turn on the fountains based on whichever one he was going by. So massive scale, all orchestrated around one man, underscoring, legitimizing, and enforcing his power. He further enforced his power by the way that he treated his nobility. Notice how huge this palace is. It's got plenty of room. So he would require, just like they did in Japan, the nobility to come and live with him. This helped him keep an eye on them. It made them super vain, focused more on clothing and that sort of thing, and so less concerned with revolting against himself. An excellent strategy. Furthermore, he eliminates a bureaucracy based around anyone except him. He centralizes the government. He centralizes the military, increases naval strength using taxation, and increases the tax burden to the poor. So you're already seeing kind of some problems that are going to end this empire. But in the period we're talking about, by 1750, France is still going strong with this absolute power. So it does actually maintain itself for a couple hundred years without concern. People are impressed by what's happening in France, and no one less so than Peter the Great. Peter the Great uses absolutism as well to expand Russia. He builds his own St. Petersburg, which you might even see is a little reminiscent of European architecture, particularly the Palace of Versailles. He also, to legitimize his rule, utilizes modernization. And here's an example of him after he came home from a trip to Europe, was so disgusted by the old-fashioned fashions of the court in Russia that he required everyone to cut off his beard and took out a pair of scissors and started chopping people's beards off. After that, there was actually a tax if you wanted to keep your beard. So he's requiring modernization. Again, notice he's increasing his power, building state building, increasing the state, but doing that by changing culture and by changing the social structure. The powers in Europe, however, were not alone. And it's very easy during this time to look at how powerful kings were getting in Europe and notice how, as a trend, they're increasing their military and increasing their taxation. But this is happening across the globe. Notice, even as we're looking at Russia in terms of this, how far it expands into Asia. So this is kind of our transition into that more Eurasian continent. They expand into Siberia. They use Siberia as both a place to send their convicts as well as a place to encourage labor. They start at first to convert people to Christianity and then realize if they're Christian, then we can't force them to work for us. And so you actually see a backing off of them trying to convert people because they want them for labor, kind of similar to what you're going to see or what we saw in Spain and the Spanish Empire. However, you certainly see as the Empire of Russia grows an increased efficiency and increased bureaucracy, a more modern system that enables ruling that large empire. Underneath, you see the Qing. And as we move to some of these Eurasian, I just want to tie this back to Europe. So Europe is spreading. Of course, they're spreading into Asia in terms of Russia, but they're also impacting the areas of Asia proper. First off, we already have seen silver was coming into China. This actually ends up destroying the economy of the Chinese, leading to the end of the Ming as they just kind of live in their own isolated palaces and bringing in a new system of the Qing. We'll talk about that in a second. And then you start to see conflict in the Indian Ocean as Europeans are trying to trade between other empires which are developing in the Middle East. The Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal, these are known as the gunpowder empires, minus the Safavid, which didn't really believe in gunpowder. The Qing are, as I just mentioned, an empire in China, which China gets their name after. They're kind of stereotypical to what we in the West now view China to be, but they're not even Chinese. They came in and invaded the Ming Dynasty from Manchuria, and they're the Manchu, and they actually maintained and were okay with their Manchu origins and yet still legitimize themselves. Very interesting. So they're establishing a new social structure. Again, change in social structure. They're establishing a new social structure where the Manchu are on top. They're the elite. They're the ones serving the emperor, being the emperor, and yet still pulling in and relying upon a lot of Chinese, very traditional power structure in order to increase and grow their empire. China gets to its largest point under the Manchu, at least up to this period, and actually continues to expand from there. So basically, how did they legitimize themselves? Well, they carried on things from the Ming. The Ming had believed that they were sons of heaven. The Qing says, so are we. Very similar to that divine right concept, except Confucian, because Confucianism believes in the mandate of heavens. They're just saying, well, we have the mandate. We're the sons of heaven. We've gotten this from heaven itself. They also used old principles like Confucianism to establish and reestablish the Chinese examination system. You see that in the picture on the right side. This was open actually to peasants, anyone educated. It certainly seemed to draw elite people, but it didn't have to. And even the elite had to pass this test. So you see changes in elite as they had to follow through on entering into the bureaucracy and actually getting the scholar gentry status that they've earned. Gentry kind of is, again, a concept that you've earned it through either money or education. Nobility is that you've been given it from the king. You've been made noble. These two structures, as they try to establish power over China, is actually pretty effectual. The Chinese military supports them. They encourage Qing expansion, but it does have some negatives, or at least some implications to the peasants. The first is the requirement for the peasants in China to wear the Manchu-style queue, the shaved head and then the long braid. Again, we think of this stereotypically Chinese, but it's not. It's Manchurian. Furthermore, because of this increased bureaucracy, people in the government start to believe that they need to be more providing for the people. And as they provide for the people, you start to see them storing away food. This leads to food riots ultimately, which is going to end the Qing.